Hello all, this week we will cover Chapter 14, Health Psychology. In part 1 of the video, we will first discuss what is stress, events that can cause stress, the impact of a stressor on our physical functioning and our immune system, and last, how our cognitive factors, basically how we interpret and think about the stress, affect our experience of the stress. So, although the primary content of the chapter is all about stress, let's begin by discussing about health. What is health? You might think of health as physical health. So then, what is physical health? It might be people who are constantly engaging in exercises, eating healthy foods, are involved in healthy relationships, sleeping well, and the list could just go on and on and on. And of course, there is mental health as well, which may include some of the things we already discussed, such as exercising regularly and engaging in healthy relationships. But it may also include practicing meditation or connecting with our religious and spiritual beliefs. So, although we might know health is important, the content of health may differ greatly. So my next question is, when we are healthy in a state of good mental well-being, does that mean we don't have any diagnosis of mental illness? What do y'all think? Research says that a state of good mental well-being and mental illness can co-occur and are actually described in separate dimensions. In other words, it is possible to be in a state of optimal mental well-being but also experience mental illness. And it is also possible to be not mentally healthy but with no mental illness. Of course, it is quite rare to have a diagnosable mental illness among people with mental well-being compared to people with minimal mental well-being. But what's important to keep in mind here is that just because an individual does not have diagnosable mental illness does not mean this person has optimal mental well-being. So this leads to the two goals of health psychology, which is to prevent and treat illness, but also to establish and maintain health. Again, because just preventing and treating illness is not enough for people to flourish and live a fulfilling, meaningful life. So first, let's make sure we understand some of the basic terminology. So in psychology, the term stress refers to responses to stressors that threaten individuals and tax their coping abilities. So stress is our response. And stressors is the event that cause a stress reaction. So when you are in a situation when people are constantly asking you to do multiple things, this is an example of stressor. And because of this event, our body may react in various ways, such as having headaches, fatigue, or depending on drug or alcohol. And there are many other responses we may encounter. And these are all examples of stress. And to just give you a few other examples of a stressor, that could include taking an exam, being involved in an injury, and experiencing relationship issues. These can be considered as a stressor. So what kind of stressors do you think may cause greater stress? According to the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, SRRS, these are an examples of stressors, and the higher the value of the life change units shown on the second column, the greater the stress. And looking at these stressors, what do you notice? Obviously, death and separation from close others elicit greater level of stress. But notice that there are some events that we may consider as happy, positive events, such as marriage, pregnancy, vacation, or Christmas. These are in fact considered as a stressor because it does involve some changes in our lives and may disrupt our daily routine we may have. And the reason why I'm showing this list of events is that we need to be very mindful of these stressors because we may already be experiencing a lot of them. And of course, the more we are juggling with these stressors in this list, the higher the stress reaction we will experience. So don't minimize just because, oh, it's positive life event, it will not elicit any stress because it will increase our level of stress. Next, we will discuss how a stressor may affect the physical functioning of the body. So has there been a time when you realized that the exam was tomorrow? If you have, I imagine all the adrenaline is rushing through your body to prepare to act on the next step. In this particular example, what would you think you would do next? Perhaps pull an all-nighter and study for the exam? You will be using all the energy to study. However, after you studied all night and took the exam, you probably will be so tired, you might go straight back to your home and crash into your bed. So these three processes or stages in how our body reacts to the stress is called the general adaptation syndrome. So the first stage is alarm stage, and then the resistant, and the last exhaustion stage. In the alarm stage, the levels of resistance drops at first as the sympathetic nervous system quickly activates. But then the resistance quickly increases as our body prepares its defense system. And in the resistance stage, the body is working at a much increased level of resistance, basically using our resources until the stress ends or the resources runs out. And finally, in the exhaustion stage, the body is no longer able to resist as the resources have been depleted. And at this point, an individual is literally worn out and become susceptible to, for example, a disease, and even death is possible. This is just another illustration of the general adaptation syndrome. So notice that sympathetic nervous system is activated during the alarm and resistance stages when we need to resist the stressor. So basically, it allows our body to prepare to fight against the stressor by increasing the blood flow and releasing the sugar into our bloodstream for energy. But our body cannot maintain this level of energy, and eventually it will run out of sugar and cause extreme level of fatigue. So what happens to our immune system while under a stressor? Immune system is basically our body responding against diseases, infection, and injuries. But as we saw in the GAS, our body would not be able to maintain our resistance for a long period of time. So when we are under stress, it increases the level of cortisol, which is basically a type of hormone that is important for our functioning of our body. But when there are too much, then it could lead to a number of health problems, such as weakened immune system. But there are certain things that we could do to make our immune system stronger. So do you have any ideas? So when we talked about motivation and emotion chapter, we discussed about the importance of positive emotion. And although there needs to be more research on this, the research has shown that people who are happier are known to have a better immune system. And of course, eating healthy diet and having enough sleep are also known to be related to better immune system. So as we have been discussing about the negative influence of prolonged stress, when the stressor continues for more than a month but less than 6 months, then a study has shown that we are twice as likely to catch a cold compared to when we have no stressor. And this likelihood continues to increase as the duration of a stressor continues. And note that it has been several months since the semester started. So if the classes has been a stressor for you, then we need to be extra mindful and careful of our mental health and eating healthy diet and sleeping well. Otherwise, again, it has increased our chance of catching a cold. And the last concept we will go over is how our cognition influences stress. So for example, how would you respond if you received a C on the next exam? For people who are getting mostly A's on their classes will probably be very disappointed. But how about those who have been getting B's and C's in their classes? Probably not as disappointing compared to those who are getting A's on their classes. So why are the responses different even though the same exact event happened? That is because our cognition, basically our belief and thoughts about the particular event matters. So the importance of our cognitive appraisal was proposed by a psychologist named Richard Lazarus. So basically how we interpret the event matters. For example, to what degree do we see the event as harmful, threatening, or a challenge? And the amount of resources we have to cope determines the magnitude of our stress. So do you all remember the Cannon-Bird and James Lange theory when we covered chapter on emotion, motivation and emotion? Actually, the role of cognitive appraisal could be added to one of these theories on emotion. Because depending on our appraisal of threats, that would relate to whether we experience fear or not. So for example, if we see a ferocious bear, but if we were at the zoo or if we had a tranquilizer gun, then we may not experience the same level of fear or bodily responses when we did not have one. So it becomes important to consider the interpretation of the event and also the presence of resources we have. So we can categorize the process of appraisal into two steps. So the first step is known as a primary appraisal, where we would estimate the severity of a stressor and classify it as either a threat or a challenge. The second step is the secondary appraisal, which is when we would estimate the resources available for coping with the stressor. So using the same example of receiving a C on exam, for people who thinks that this event is a threat, believing that they will no longer be competitive for applying for certain jobs or graduate school, then they are more likely to experience stress compared to those who view this event as a challenge, meaning that they might be able to learn and grow from this experience. The second appraisal is about the available resources. So if the individual perceives the event as a threat, if they have resources, then they might not experience intense level of stress. This may be, for example, whether they have a group of peers that they could study together, or if they have personal resource, such as being willing to ask questions if they did not understand certain content. Then these individuals would experience less stress compared to those without resources. So this is a chart that just summarizes what we just talked about. So starting from the top, after an individual encounters a potential stressor, the amount of stress will first depend by how threatening is the event to their well-being. If not, then there will be no stress. But if they perceive as harmful, then it leads to bodily reactions and also secondary appraisal, assessing how much resources the individual has in dealing with the stressor. And if the individual does not have adequate resources, then it creates stress. But if an individual is able to create or have adequate resources, then they will be able to use the resources and experience less stress. As this content could be easily applied to our daily life, I really encourage you to apply these theories and see how it works for you. So that's all I got for part 1 of health psychology. And if you have any questions or need clarification, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in part 2 of the video. Thanks and take care.